Our team members take pride in our roots. We grew up on farms, we live on farms, and we serve farms every day. At Armor Animal Health, our veterinarians help you detect diseases through our state-of-the-art lab. Our pharmacy then helps deliver the right solutions to keep your herd healthy. With locations across the United States, we have the ability to supply thousands of products to your door. When you kick off your boots at night, know that defending your herd isn't our job, but a way of life.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this week on Have You Heard? Armor Animal Health's video series. I'm Wayne Keil, Territory Manager here in Wisconsin. I have been with Armor and now Animal Health, Armor, and Animart for 30 years. I also run a small cow-calf beef operation here in Wisconsin and the city of Beaver Dam. Join us today is Rob Costello. Rob is a technical and business support manager at Milk Specialties for 6 years and has spent over 20 years milk replacer manufacturing, technical support, and calf management. Welcome, Rob.
Oh, thank you, Wayne.
Just to let you know, we've got people all over the United States: Georgia, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Missouri, Montana, Oregon, all viewing with us today, Rob.
Well, now you got me worried. So, well, that's good news. Good news.
Well, Rob, adding milk replacer powder to water and mixing it seems pretty simple. But when it comes to actual weighing, mixing, and feeding milk replacer to calves, there are quite a few issues that could come in effect. The milk replacer and the calf have a lot to do with proper nutrition. This is where science comes into play. Rob, can you take us through the science of getting milk replacer from the bag into the calf?
Sure. I sure can, Wayne. You mentioned that it's that measuring and mixing milk replacers is pretty basic. I mean, it's a pretty basic physical process, and there's lots of articles that have been written. There's videos that have been written or made. I've done my share of those on the how-to, the steps along the way, and that's not really what I want to talk about today. I want to kind of take a look more under the hood and look at some of the areas that are really directly involved in where you can get things maybe a little bit out of whack, I suppose, in terms of the solution or in terms of what actually ends up going into the calf. And kind of those are the areas that I want people to think about and to what I want to highlight today. And I really kind of three main areas. And one is would be temperature and solubility in actually mixing the milk replacer. Another is solids. I think solids is over the years, and then since we've had lots of different changes in milk replacers, we've had lots of new options and mixing options at different solids level. That becomes really important to know where you are and what the impact of that is. And so I want to spend time talking about that, and also something that's it's kind of like a subset of solids, closely related. Part of it is called concentration. They're not the same, but you can really get into trouble if your concentrations are getting out of whack, even though solids may not be that far off. So I want to cover those three areas. The first I want to talk about was the temperature and solubility. Temperature is an important part of solubility. We typically recommend that milk replacers be mixed at 110 degrees. And if you mix colder than that, like for some reason, if you're mixing, say, at 80 degrees, there's a good likelihood that you're not going to get all of the ingredients into that solution. So in a sense, you're kind of feeding a portion of that as a wet milk replacer powder rather than getting everything into solution, which is what we really are trying to do. And that can possibly lead to some digestibility issues or some digestion changes in the calf because it's getting something the way it's not really intending, that we haven't intended it to. You may want to feed it a cold temperature. That's fine. I mean, if you have a cold feeding system where you're feeding like an ad lib feeding system, you want the calves to not eat all the milk replacers they possibly can. So you feed it to them cold so that they self-limit. But you don't want to mix it at 80 degrees. You want to mix it at 110 and then let them eat it at 80 or back down to room temperature, whatever that is.
So Rob, what happens when you actually mix hot water with milk replacer?
When you're mixing hot water, now that's kind of an interesting world. It's too hot. When we make milk replacer, we actually take the fat particles and encapsulate them in protein. That allows something that's insoluble, the fat particles, to go into solution. and go into solution readily at the temperature that, like 110. But if you take that temperature up high, like about 160, 165, maybe up in that range, you can end up with a couple of conditions where you're actually changing the nature of the protein a little bit so that the protein on that coating can actually stick together, and the product will form, you'll end up with like fat clumps in the milk replacer that you can see. Another thing that can happen is that the proteins themselves will come off the fat, and you'll end up with these fat particles joining together, forming like an oil slick. And typically you notice that problem through like a greasy film on mixing or feeding equipment. If that's happening, your temperature is likely too high. So at either end, either extreme, it was too cold or too hot, you're changing the nature of the product. It's actually getting into the calf, and you possibly can run into some problems with digestion or digestibility.
So if you mix a milk replacer at the correct temperature around 110 degrees, can you feed it cold to calves? Is it properly dissolved that the calf will get all the nutrients out of it, or do you prefer a warmer temperature? I know the calf probably prefers a warmer temperature.
Have you mixed it if you mix it
at the correct temperature is a question.
And you fix it and feed it colder, the cat things aren't going to be falling out of solution, if that's your question. They're going to stay in solution, but the issue is that the calf is not going to eat as much as it might, because of this cold temperature. They're going to self-limit.
Sure.
There is an issue with, if you're feeding cold milk replacer, these calves do have access to eating more anytime they want. But if you're limiting milk replacer intake, if you're feeding cold milk replacer, the calf is going to have to, or just by natural processes, will be warming that up in its body to its body temperature. So that is actually wasted energy, warming that back up that could be used on growth or defense, protecting itself in defense mechanisms and stuff.
So here in Wisconsin, we've gone through, and throughout the Midwest and even other states have gone through some cold weather here lately. So how hot can you mix the milk replacer and then feed it to the calves? Because you want to mix it a little higher, because the time you get out to the calves, it might be cooled off quite a bit. How high can you mix that milk replacer at?
Okay. Well, the temperature that you want to, and I know everybody's measuring this. I'm sure they are measuring the temperature that the calves are drinking it at. Actually, I know very few people that actually do that, but it's supposed to be 102 degrees. So if it's cold outside, you may need to mix it higher than 110. Now, the 110, the way I look at it, is really kind of the lower temperature mix threshold. So you can actually take it up higher, not too high. But I think when you look at some products out there that are mainly for other species, there's ingredients in them that don't, that actually need a higher temperature to go into solution. So, and even their instructions will tell you to mix it higher. I would say 145 is about as high as I'd go.
Sure. And I think we talked before about in the cold weather not mixing up as much, so that last few calves don't get the cold milk all the time. Smaller batches.
Right.
That keeps the temperature a little quicker to feed smaller groups of calves.
Right. A little bit more effort, but that's important for the calves. Yes.
So another question, you mentioned the importance of milk solids. What does the solids levels do for the calf? What are you aiming for when you mix it to get certain solids? Tell me a little bit about that.
Solids is really important, and it's changed quite a bit from what we did like 20 years ago. When you look at whole milk, it's about 12.5% solids. For Holstein, it's about 12.5% solids. Maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we were mixing it up so the milk replacers were actually 11.5% solids. But today, the average mixing instruction out there on most products, general products, is going to be about where you're mixing about 1.25 pounds of a powder into a gallon of water is about 13% solids. So the normal range that you want to be in is between the 13 to 15%. If you're within that range, things are, it's not guaranteed to be everything perfect, but that's the area I think where you're the safest to be. If you start mixing up higher than that, like the max you can get to is about 18%. Beyond that, you're just asking for it. And some of the formulas out there tell you to mix at a ratio that's 13%, some are 15, even a couple have been 17. But when you start getting out there, you get into problems. And knowing where you are, the kind of problems that you get into when solids gets too high is that the calf is going to have to dilute the solids down in its digestive tract. So it's going to have to take water either from his bloodstream or from the additional water, of course, that you're giving the calf, to put into his digestive tract to dilute it down. And you may not get all that water back out by the time it moves through the calf. So you can end up causing things like scours, diarrhea, or dehydration, I should say, and possibly even bloat are kind of the things that can happen when solids gets too high. And so when you're measuring solids, that's the question you asked, was how to measure solids.
Yeah, how do you go about measuring solids?
Finally getting around to that. So you can either use a refractometer, or something that people use, especially if you've got where you're mixing like if you have whole milk, then you're mixing that with milk replacer. A lot of people that are in that world say, I'm going to mix and feed milk replacer. Every feeding is going to be 14.5% solids or 15% solids. That's what I'm going to give. They'll use a refractometer to measure their whole milk, and then they'll calculate how much powder to put in to take it to 15% solids. So they're doing it every time they're mixing a batch of milk replacer or a batch of feed for the calves. But what you do need to do, what I would recommend people do, is actually go out and take you have to use a scale. So if you're using a scoop, that's the most variable of all ways that you can be measuring milk replacer. But take an average scoop, I guess, that you would end up putting in a gallon of water and figure out what that is. But I've got a formula here that I want to share that I want to put it on the screen, because when people talk to me about mathematics and they run through calculations and tell me what they're doing and ask me if I glaze over real fast, and I don't want everybody out there to glaze over. So I got a screen help up here. And this is looking at a standard mix rate. And basically what we're doing, as I mentioned before, it's 1.25 pounds, and you can plug in whatever weight you have for the powder you're putting into a gallon to make this calculation. So you take the 1.25 pounds, and we know that a gallon of water weighs 8.3 pounds. So we don't actually have to measure anything else here. We know that the water weighs 8.3 pounds. So we add those two together to come up with a total. And in this case, it's 9.6. Now, the rest of this is all just it's a percentage calculation, which a lot of us make all the time. We just take we have to find out what percent of the total that the milk replacer is. So we divide the milk replacer by the total weight, and we come up with 0.13 or 13% solids. Used a lot of words there, but that's the simple calculation that everybody, I think, should make to find out where they are. And that assumes, though, that you're in a kind of this scenario is that if you've got a 5-gallon bucket and you're putting in, say, 4 gallons of milk or 4 gallons of water, and you're putting in enough milk replacer powder to feed those 4 calves, and then mix that up and then take it out and feed your calves, that's 13% solids. But if you take that same bucket, the 5-gallon bucket, and put water in it, and if this is your style, and then you add enough powder to feed, say, 5 calves, and then you mix that up and take it all the way up to the top, now you've got 5 gallons of liquid there. That's a very different solids level than the previous one that I told you. Now you're both using the same relative concept in terms of how much powder you're putting in, but the water is very different here. So I have another slide here that I want to share with you that talks about this one. So again, the powder's the same, and you just plug in whatever weight you have to use in this calculation, but 1.25 pounds. We don't know what the weight of the water is, but we know, now you can either weigh the final solution or use this here. This is a average weight of, say, of whole milk, which is about 8.6 pounds. It's the same calculation where you take the powder, divide that by the final solution, and in this case, it's 14.5% solids. So that's very different than the solids in the previous example. So you do need to know where you are with this. And so that's really, and that's kind of my message on this, is really kind of figure out where you are, because that has a big impact on what you can and can't do. If you're thinking about being cold outside and wanting to add additional powder to the water, you're in a much better situation if you're starting at 13% solids than if you're starting at 15%. Because if you start concentrating that more, you're getting more toward the danger area where you can be causing problems inside that calf.
I had a couple of questions come in. A little bit back on the mixing and going in the solution milk replacer. So a couple of questions. So can you take the extra milk replacer after it's been mixed as a solution and put it in your refrigerator, and why can't you store it in the refrigerator for the next feeding? And then the other one is, what would cause the milk replacer after being mixed properly to go out of a solution?
It wouldn't go out of solution. Take the second one first.
Okay.
That's the one that struck me the most. It should not go out of solution. That's why,
Okay.
I mean, unless it hasn't gone in, where
Yeah.
it's kind of just swirling around in there, it may drop off. It hasn't really.
Correct. A good milk replacer, that would lead you back to a good milk replacer that's, all milk and is made to be dissolved in water easily. There's some other milk replacers out there that don't mix as well, correct?
Yeah, there certainly could be. And especially some of the ingredients are not going to go into solution real well. You try to swirl them in so that they stay in with the rest of everything for a while.
Sure.
They'll eventually fall out of solution. And some ingredients will do that, like soy is one of those. They'll do that.
Yeah, the other question was, how come you can't store your milk after it's been mixed in?
Well, the main thing is bacteria building up, I think, inside of that. Some of it you can. You got, like, I know when feeding things like lamb milk replacer, people do tend to store that a little bit. But if the question was, I was wondering if that question had to do with is it just mixing up milk replacer ahead of time and storing it, or is it?
Yes, and then rewarming it again and feeding it again.
I suppose you could. There shouldn't be anything wrong with the solution, but except, again, the bacteria count. There should be bacteria building up.
And properly warming, I guess, would be more difficult.
Right. And yeah, I'm sure people do that, but that's not typically what we run into or recommend.
So, Rob, how do different nutritional supplements that you'd add to your milk replacer affect the solids?
That's where concentration comes in. And by that, I mean, concentration is like a subset of solids, but it's not exactly the same thing. And people can really get into trouble with this by not being aware of what's actually happening. Give an example of concentration. There's a sodium, which is a really, really, really small particle, and that's a component in milk replacers. Is if you were to take a gram of sodium and you were to mix that up in some volume of water, and you were to take a gram of protein, which is much, much, much larger, and mix that into the same volume of water, the solids would be the same, but the concentration, because that sodium is so much smaller than the protein, the concentration of that solution is far greater than the concentration in the protein solution. And eventually we're going to get around to answering your question, but that's the first part of it. And that concentration is something that typically we're going to call osmolarity is the term for it, one of the terms for it. And its measurement is actually something called millimoles. And I'm not going to be using that term because I don't want people to drop off this call here, but I will give you an example where I use it. The osmolarity of milk, of regular whole milk, is about 300 millimoles. The osmolarity of plasma is about 290 to 300 in that range, just to give you a base for where that is. Milk replacer, the osmolarity is about 450 to 550, given the normal range of mixing. If you start concentrating it more than that, you're going to be higher than that. But the reason that milk replacer is higher, one of the main reasons, is because we actually fortify that with minerals, which I said are really small, and vitamins, which are pretty small. And so we fortify the milk replacer above what you normally find in milk, whole milk. And so that's why the major reason for the difference in osmolarity. But one of the issues with osmolarity is that when you get osmolarity up to, say, 600 and above, you start slowing the rate at which the abomasum empties. So the residence time of the liquid increases. And under normal circumstances, you've got bacteria flowing through the digestive tract. You may have some Clostridium or Sarcina that are not going to be a problem under normal circumstances. But if you slow that rate of passage, now these guys are going to start really, really reproducing, and the growth rate's going to go through the roof. They're going to be producing things like toxins, gas. You can end up creating a situation where you've got diarrhea, you've got bloat, and other conditions there that and dehydration that are happening just because the solids are too high, because the calf is trying to dilute it down, like I described earlier. And it's going to stay there until it gets diluted and then move down. So the higher the concentration, the worse that is. And so it's not just a matter of solids, it's like what makes up that solids. It's important. To give you an example here, what's important here, now we're going to talk about products. If you take products like that have direct-fed microbials, such as you got prebiotics, probiotics, protein-type supplements, you've got fat supplements, things like that, milk and milk replacer are really a good avenue to move these nutritional supplements into calves. And they're really good. And these products I just described are not going to have really an effect on the osmolarity. So it's fine to use that as a tool. But I know there got to be people listening that are taking things like that are mineral based or strictly minerals and glucose, things like that are fairly small in size, like electrolytes, and they're putting that into milk or milk replacer. That you might not want to be doing. Well, I wouldn't do that personally, because when you look at the osmolarity of milk electrolytes, like the dose of electrolytes, typically, if you take powdered electrolytes, put that in water for one dose, the osmolarity there is going to be about from anywhere from over 300 to up over 700. So if you take that and add that to the milk replacer or the milk, you've added that osmolarity. So it's additional because you're putting it right into the same liquid that's in the milk or milk replacer. So milk, if that makes any sense, I'll just give an example here. Milk now jumps from 300 when you put electrolytes in it to up to over 600 to 900 will be its osmolarity. If you put that electrolyte into milk replacer, that's going to jump up to 750, up between 750 and about 1275. That's a huge osmolarity in what you're trying to give those calves. So in other words, you do not want to be very cautious if you're thinking about putting electrolytes into milk. I know that instructions will tell you can do that. And it's true that you're not going to be making poisonous compounds like arsenic by adding electrolytes into milk or milk replacer. But I can't think of any way that the manufacturer of those products have put that on their instructions that you can do that. They haven't done anything magically to get around what I just described. That's a real world thing that's happening. So electrolytes are designed by their very nature to go into water, and that's what the calf needs is water. And the sodium, the glucose, and the amino acids that are in many of the electrolytes are there to help enhance water absorption. So that's a process that needs to be happening separate from feeding milk or milk replacer. You don't put the two together to take care of a sick calf. And so somebody's going to ask, can you put a little bit of electrolytes in? Well, sure, you can, but it's kind of at your own risk. I really wouldn't, that's something I'd do.
Rob, is there a way of testing your milk replacer for osmolarity?
You can, but I don't know that I'd bother because it's you have to send it off to a diagnostic lab, like at a university somewhere, perhaps. It's not something that's done easily. So you kind of just have to be aware of the types of ingredients and just the size of the particles. Now, I'm one who's willing to get online and start looking at molecular weights of things. Nobody else is going to want to do that. So,
sure.
But in general, when you look at products that are minerals, and even vitamins are not a whole lot large. They are larger than minerals, but they're still fairly small in the grand scheme of things.
Sure.
That if you start adding those products to, especially milk replacer, you're really ratcheting up the osmolarity. And things like, you think about other sources of like sodium that might go into water. I am not by any means an expert on water softeners. I'm not the guy to talk to, but I'd recommend you talk to a specialist about that. But they do tend to put sodium into the water. So, I mean, I've been involved in situations where trying to troubleshoot why a farm that's using milk replacer is having calves that are stargazing, for example, or lots of scours or bloat. And when you get down to it and do a water sample, you'll find that the water softener is way out of whack, and it's putting in lots of sodium into the water, and that's even before the milk replacer is put into it. So you've got the osmolarities through the roof, and you're getting bloat, scours.
Sure.
And when in one case I said they even had the sodium toxicity was so high, so that the combination of the milk replacer and the water itself took sodium over the limit for a couple of the calves. So keep things like that in mind too when you're trying to troubleshoot or thinking about making changes. And some of these farms have still stay with a water softener, but will take non-water softened water to feed the calves, just to take that out of the loop.
Yeah, calves are pretty touchy little critters. There's lots of ins and outs. Your solids is a big thing also. Weighing your milk replacer, your water amounts. Here's another couple of questions that came in. And if you have some more questions out there, please feel free to send them in. We'll try to get some answers here in the next few minutes. This is a question of, can you mix too much water into your solution? Which goes back to your diagram a little bit.
Yes, you can, and you end up with something that's too weak. So is that what I'm hearing?
Some of your fat protein in there. That's
problematic too. It's just you're not getting enough nutrients into the calf. I not seeing that too much these days. Like I used to see that more often when calves weren't doing well, when you're feeding 8 ounces of powder and 2 quarts. That's not what the typical mix rate today is. But the solids there would be 11 and a half. And if you're mixing too much water in and dropping it too low, you get health issues with the calf.
We've got another question from a viewer. Martha asked, 9 liters per day they're feeding calves. In hutches, 2 times a day feeding or 3 times a day do you recommend on a 9 liter feeding?
You do what you have to do, but I would say that dividing it up over 3 feedings is probably, there's other things that are going on inside that calf too, in terms of acidity in its digestive tract, and it'd be better to feed it over 3 times than over 2 times.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's been the latest, the most recommend feeding it 3 times a day. It's a labor issue. It's a timing issue. Try to space your feedings out the same if you can, which makes an early morning feeding and a later night feeding a lot of times.
I want to do that one, yeah. So you kind of know what's the best, but then actually implementing it is tough. It's tough.
Here's another question, and this touches on something we talked about yesterday. You and I discussed different. The question is best method to transfer a calf from whole milk to milk replacer, which leads into the question we had yesterday. If you were to switch from one company's milk replacer to, of course, your product's milk replacer, during that transition of switching calves, how would you do that, and what do you recommend?
Well, there's 2 ways of doing it. If you've got a system where you've got whole milk and you're going to switch that over to milk replacer, if that's what I'm hearing right.
Yep.
Or if you got one milk replacer and you're switching to another, the way to avoid that, there's 2 ways. One is that the new calves coming in get the milk replacer, the new milk replacer, or get milk replacer, and you feed the rest of the calves out on what they had before. That's that's not going to have any problems. But if you have to switch them all, commingling for a while, several days to a week or something like that, just commingling the old with the new is a way to get them used to it and kind of do it in step form. Yeah,
mixing the 2 together if you're doing milk replacement.
Right,
that's transition.
That's
for a week or so.
That's what I should have said instead of commingling.
Just helping you out a little
bit. Yeah, that's the terminology. Yeah.
Another question, Rob. A little different subject: bottle feeding versus pail feeding. Any preference? What have you seen and heard?
Boy, I have my preferences, and I really do, and it stems from experiences with like calf operations that use bottles. I mean, when you a calf puts its head into a bucket, it's submersing it in down into the bucket, and anything that's going on with the milk or milk replacer that is an aromatic type issue is going to make the calf back up and not want to drink that, whereas in a bottle, it's not going to be an issue. Calves can tend, when they're drinking out of buckets, they can end up aspirating milk and you kind of hear it as a rattly, raspy sound at the end of milking. You can hear it across some of the calves. That's opening the door a little bit, maybe toward pneumonia and some other issues that you could develop respiratory problems. My personal preference, if I could do it, would be bottles.
Sure.
I just would.
And a lot of the larger dairies have gone to that because they found the bottles keep the calves from doing the aspiration or getting the lungs with any fluids going the wrong direction. But they also have automatic bottle washers, and that certainly helps some too.
We just you fill 10 bottles at a time or more.
Yeah. So another question on that transition from, we said that if you're switching from whole milk to milk replacer, how about from colostrum into milk replacer? Some calves don't like the milk replacer. Is it a flavoring in the milk replacer? Or is it just some that you have to adapt the calf, or do you mix the two together for feeding? Would that help at all?
Well, I think we're finding now that people are wanting to feed colostrum longer, like in a pooled colostrum, and actually kind of blending it might not be such a bad thing to get calves used to it. It's a very different liquid than colostrum is. So calves that are, like I said, if it's in a bucket, you're probably more, if it's a aromatic thing, you're probably more likely to see that in a bucket than you would if it's in the bottle world. But I mean, buckets are kind of notorious for that. But if you only have a few calves, buckets are pretty, or if you don't have a whole lot of calves, buckets are oftentimes a lot easier to handle and feed that way. So yeah, commingling maybe for a little bit. That might be the way to go, or adding a pooled colostrum over time, I suppose. I mean, you know what I mean, right? People are recommending the colostrum be fed longer than just the one feeding.
So, Rob, I've got time for one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap things up. I really appreciate your insight discussing the different milk replacer strengths of fat and protein. So your 2220s, even higher, like 24s or 2020s. So what do you recommend there? What do you see the differences are, or what do you see most people transitioning to? Anything special there?
Sometimes, when you look at 22, I think people are going a little bit higher on proteins over the 2020, a lot. I mean, in a lot of areas. It used to be when it was mostly just 2020s being fed. In regions, you'd find 2220s. So it was a group here and there, and so certain regions would favor the 2220 or the 2020. And when you're feeding that at the same rate, you didn't see a big difference in the calf. I mean, you know that you're feeding more protein, you know that you're giving a little bit more that's going to be going to growth. You know this, but you might not be seeing it measurably that much in the calves. But when you're feeding, more and more protein, that typically goes along with a higher feeding rate. And sometimes I'll actually lower the fat level so that doesn't interfere with starter intake. So that's the belief that can interfere with starter intake. But you're trying to ratchet the protein up, increase the total amount the calf gets, and push the growth rate on the calf. Is that more than what you asked for?
Oh, that's perfect. That's perfect what I'm looking for. And thanks a lot, Rob, for answering these questions we had come through. And we'll have more questions after this seminar is over. We'll just keep feeding those informational questions in, and we'll get them answered back to you. Again, thank you, Rob Costello from Milk Specialties, for spending some time with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Any further remarks to close things?
Just if people wanted more on, if they wanted to go to the YouTube channel for Milk Specialties Global Animal Nutrition, and you have to type that in, Milk Specialties Global Animal Nutrition, into YouTube. Click on the banner that comes up. You can actually get to a whole series of videos. One of them is called The Science of Mixing Milk Replacers, which is a lot of this, but a lot more how-to, I think, involved in that. It's a whole series that we got on calf management tips with Elizabeth Marvel. I'll be going out with Elizabeth this spring to make 3 or 4 more videos. There's 11 in that series already. If you haven't gone there and haven't seen them, take a look.
I've been there myself, Rob, and there's a lot of information there, that's for sure. We hope everyone's learned something useful as far as information that Rob's provided today, and you can apply it to your operation in some way. Please feel free to share with your friends. This video is being recorded, so you can view it at any time on Facebook or at our website, armoranimalhealth.com/have you heard. If you're wanting to watch next seminar, that'll be in March. We have March 4th. Leslie Gravatt, our veterinary relations manager, talks a little bit about the ins and outs of handling lab samples with our lab director, Heidi Anderson. Thank you, everyone. And remember, feel free to send in some more questions, and we'll try to get them answered as soon as possible. Thanks again, Rob.
My pleasure, Wayne.